Disclaimer. This is a fictional story, but the lessons about family, betrayal, and building something that lasts are very real. Let me know in the comments down below. My father always told me that a man is only as good as the foundation he builds upon. If the concrete is cracked, it doesn't matter how beautiful the house looks on the outside. Eventually, the entire structure is going to come crashing down. My name is Thomas Livingston. I'm 35 years old, a former military combat engineer, and a man who spent his entire life believing that blood and loyalty were the same thing. Dead wrong, and the brutal education that corrected my naive worldview cost me 48 hours of intense, suffocating grief, 3 agonizing weeks of strategic, calculated silence, and 1 explosive courtroom moment that I will replay in my head with absolute satisfaction for the rest of my natural life. Let me take you back to the beginning, before the betrayal, before the greed, and before a single sentence on a piece of paper left an entire room absolutely speechless. My father, Robert Livingston, built Livingston General Contractors from the absolute dirt up. He started with a rusty used Ford pickup truck that had a cracked windshield, a personal loan of exactly $12,000 from my grandfather, and a commercial construction license he had studied for by flashlight while working grueling night shifts as a framing carpenter. By the time I was born in the late 80s, he had 4 dedicated employees who would have walked through fire for him. The company boasted a massive fleet of heavy equipment, 2 sprawling equipment yards, a rock-solid reputation for delivering on time, and a loyal workforce of nearly 110 people. But if you looked at my dad, you would never know he was a millionaire. He was not a showy man. He despised flashiness. He drove the exact same battered Ford F-250 for 12 long years. He called a bluff when he saw one, shook hands with a grip that could crush walnuts, and slept 8 solid hours every single night because, as he always said, a man who is tired makes bad, expensive decisions. To the wealthy, snobby circles of Phoenix, he was often dismissed at first glance. They didn't see the tactical genius who could look at a blueprint and instantly spot a structural flaw that 3 architects had missed. He was also, unfortunately, a man who fell deeply in love twice. My mother, Carol, was the love of his youth. She passed away from a sudden brain aneurysm when I was just 13 years old. My dad was devastated in that quiet, heavy way that strong men are. He never cried in front of me. If that wall cracked, everything would fall. Then, in 2007, he met Sandra. Sandra was 31 years old at the time. She was sharp-looking, impeccably dressed, dangerously articulate, recently divorced from a short, lucrative first marriage, and working as a high-end office manager at a commercial real estate brokerage in wealthy Scottsdale. She was friendly, but it was that calculated, engineered friendliness that some people have. She was warm enough to be superficially likable, yet careful enough never to let you fully inside her walls. My dad was lonely in a way that men of his generation never quite know how to articulate. He had spent years building a kingdom, but he had no queen to share the quiet evenings with. My father was 62, I was 20 years old, fresh out of basic training and already hyper-aware of my surroundings. I watched the entire courtship and marriage from a careful, polite, tactical distance. And Sandra was a walking, talking anomaly. She was never openly cruel to me. She was something much harder to define. Every family holiday carried a slight, vibrating tension underneath the expensive wine and pleasantries. What disgusted me the most was how she treated my father behind closed doors, or when she thought no one was listening. "Oh, Robert just loves playing handyman," she would say, dismissing his life's work as a quaint little hobby. My dad never seemed to notice the disrespect. I spent a long time trying to figure out which one it was. But what I knew for absolute certain was that by the time I had returned from my military service and integrated into the company as a senior project manager, Sandra had quietly, systematically, and ruthlessly made herself indispensable to the business. She had no background in construction. She couldn't tell a joist from a beam, but she had smoothly positioned herself as the company's executive office director. She had a sprawling corner desk in the office, and my dad practically bragged to his friends that she had really stepped up to take the administrative burden off his shoulders. I didn't trust it, not for a single second. My background in military intelligence and logistics meant I was trained to look for patterns, to find the loose thread and pull it until the whole sweater unraveled. Small, easily overlooked things, a massive vendor invoice for structural steel that seemed wildly inflated compared to current market rates. Mileage reimbursements for delivery routes that didn't match any of our active job sites. I mentioned it once to my father, in October 2021. I was very careful. We were sitting across his kitchen table, the early morning light cutting through the blinds. He looked at me with eyes that suddenly looked incredibly tired and old. "Thomas," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm 64 years old." "Leave it be." I dropped it. I backed off. It was a tactical error on my part. I should have pushed harder, because things got drastically worse. Early the next year, my father was diagnosed with a severe, progressive cardiac condition. It was an aggressive arrhythmia compounded by massive arterial blockage that his top cardiologist described as a ticking clock that couldn't be wound back. He underwent a brutal bypass surgery. He talked about retirement constantly, yet he stubbornly refused to actually step away from the business. And as my father grew weaker, Sandra grew bolder. She started bringing a man around the office. Sandra introduced him to the staff as her independent financial advisor, claiming he was there to help streamline our accounting software. But I saw the way they looked at each other when they thought the room was empty. The man was a parasite, and Sandra was the host feeding him my father's lifeblood. I knew deep in my gut that Marcus wasn't just a financial advisor. She was just waiting for the clock to stop ticking. And then on a cold Tuesday morning in March it did. My father passed away at 6:47 a.m. He was 67 years old. He died at home in his own bed, with Sandra allegedly sleeping right beside him. I got the phone call from her, exactly 12 minutes later. That should tell you exactly how fast I was moving. When I burst through the front door, the house was eerily quiet. I stood at the foot of his bed for a long time, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Sandra was in the kitchen. She wasn't crying, she wasn't holding his hand, she was on her cell phone with the funeral home, her voice perfectly level, low and terrifyingly efficient. I filed it away in my tactical memory, telling myself that maybe I was just being uncharitable, because my own grief was suffocating me. The funeral was held the following Friday. Big, hardened men in scuffed work boots and women in dark dresses were all pressed together in the pews, all holding the same stunned, quiet grief for a man who had built structures that would easily outlast every single person in that room. Sandra sat in the absolute front row, wearing a tailored black designer dress. She cried at the exact appropriate moments. Marcus, her financial advisor, stood 2 paces behind her the entire time, his hand occasionally brushing against the small of her back in a way that made me want to snap his wrist. 48 hours after we put my father in the ground. That's how long it took for the mask to completely slip off. On Sunday morning, while I was sitting at my kitchen table staring blankly at a cold cup of coffee, I received an email. It was from a ruthless, high-priced family law and estate attorney, based in Scottsdale, named Gerald Marsh. The email was entirely devoid of empathy. This included the multi-million-dollar family residence, all massive financial accounts held jointly or individually by my father, and most importantly, 100% of the shares in Livingston General Contractors LLC. The final paragraph was the absolute kicker. The email bluntly requested that I contact Mr. Livingston, will be appointing new executive leadership effective immediately. In other words, your father is buried, get your stuff, get out of the house, get out of the company. You are replaced. I sat there and read that email 4 times. A hot, violent, electrical flash of rage surged through my nervous system, demanding physical violence. But then, my training kicked in. Something else happened. Something much colder, darker, and infinitely more deliberate settled into my chest. I had 15 seconds to decide if I was going to lose my temper, or if I was going to win the war. I didn't panic, because a memory suddenly flashed in my mind. A memory from 3 months ago. My dad and I had been standing in the company equipment yard late one evening. Page 42. I hadn't understood it at the time. I thought his mind was slipping. But now, staring at an eviction notice from a hostile widow, it clicked. It was a secret distress code. I grabbed my keys, sprinted to my truck, and tore out of my driveway. Sandra hated it and refused to ever step foot near it because of the smell of diesel and old grease. I unlocked the heavy steel door and flipped on the flickering fluorescent lights. I flipped directly to page 42. There were no load calculations. Instead, written in my father's unmistakable, blocky handwriting, were 3 words. Behind the compressor, my heart hammered against my ribs. I walked to the back of the shop, where a massive, broken-down industrial air compressor sat against the back wall. With a grinding screech of metal on concrete, the compressor slid forward about 2 feet. Behind it was a seam in the drywall. It wasn't just a wall. It was a hidden door. I pressed my hand against the seam, found the hidden latch, and popped it open. I stepped into a cramped, windowless secret room that was barely larger than a closet. The air was stale, but the room was meticulously organized. My dad, the man everyone thought was just a simple, uneducated handyman, had built a secure intelligence bunker right under his greedy wife's nose. I opened the laptop. It wasn't password protected. It required a biometric thumbprint. But my dad had always told me we shared the exact same hands. Access granted. My jaw dropped. He had been recording it. I clicked on an audio file, dated just 3 weeks before his death. I instantly recognized Sandra's voice, and then the slick, arrogant voice of Marcus, her financial advisor. "He's fading fast, Marcus," Sandra's voice hissed through the speakers laced with venom. "The doctor said his heart is operating at 20%. It's all mine, and the son." Marcus asked smoothly. "Thomas is a meathead ex-soldier. He doesn't know the first thing about corporate litigation. We are going to be filthy rich, baby." I felt the blood drain from my face. He was a corporate liquidator, a vulture waiting for the lion to die so he could pick the bones clean. But my dad was a lion who planned ahead. I opened the first fireproof lockbox. Inside was a massive stack of forensic accounting documents. My dad hadn't ignored my warning back in 2021. It was a slam-dunk felony wire fraud case. But that wasn't the killing blow. I opened the second lockbox. Inside was a legal binder prepared by a man named Kevin Mercer. He had worked with my father for 2 decades. The documents inside the binder detailed a complete, absolute corporate restructuring. In September of the previous year, fully aware of Sandra's theft and impending betrayal, my father and Kevin had executed a brilliant, totally legal maneuver. My dad transferred every single asset: the trucks, the heavy equipment, the million-dollar government contracts, the operational accounts, the real estate, the intellectual property, and the workforce out of the LLC, and directly into a new holding entity controlled exclusively by the trust. The trustee was Kevin Mercer. The sole operational beneficiary of the trust was me. Thomas Livingston, the will that Sandra was waving around. The one from November, it was completely valid. It legally gave her 100% ownership of Livingston General Contractors LLC, but as of October, that LLC was nothing but a hollow, empty shell. My dad had mathematically amputated her from the empire, without her ever feeling the blade. I sat in the dusty, quiet room and began to laugh. It was the dark, dangerous laugh of a man who just realized he had been handed the detonator to a massive bomb, and the enemy was currently standing right on top of it. I pulled out my phone and dialed Kevin Mercer's direct line. He picked up on the second ring. "Thomas," Kevin's deep, gravelly voice echoed. "I assume you found the compressor." "I found it, Kevin. Gerald Marsh sent you the email." "Yeah, he gave me 5 days to pack my bags and clear out my desk." I could hear Kevin smile through the phone, a dry, terrifying litigation veteran smile. "Thomas, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your father anticipated this exact move. Do not fight them. Do not argue. We are going to let her walk right into the trap." "And then what?" I asked, my voice cold as ice. "And then," Kevin said, "we let them open the box." The next 3 weeks were an agonizing exercise in extreme psychological and emotional discipline. The trap only works if the prey doesn't see the teeth. My lawyer, Kevin Mercer, formally responded to Gerald Marsh's aggressive eviction email. Kevin's response was a terrifying masterclass in tactical submission. He delivered it with the measured, unbothered calm of a man who has destroyed powerful people in boardrooms most folks will never even see. Kevin stated clearly that Thomas Livingston did not intend to contest the will. He would comply fully with the terms of the November document. Just complete and utter surrender. Gerald Marsh was reportedly stunned by the lack of resistance. He was a high-priced legal shark expecting a bloody, expensive fight in the water, and instead, the prey just rolled over and offered its throat. Sandra, however, was absolutely ecstatic. It was the very first time she had spoken to me directly since the morning my father died. "Thomas, I'm glad we can handle this like adults. Your father would want us to move forward peacefully as family. Gerald will handle the paperwork. Move forward as family." And she had the unmitigated nerve to use the word family. I typed my reply with slow, steady fingers. "I agree, Sandra. I just want my father's final wishes respected to the letter." I hit send. I meant every single word of it. She just didn't know what his final wishes actually were. During the weeks leading up to the official court hearing, I kept going into the main office every single day. Doug ran the daily operations with total, icy competence. ensuring the massive commercial construction projects didn't pause for a single second for the incoming personal drama. Sandra didn't come into the office during this entire time. She was eagerly counting millions of dollars that simply didn't exist. The official transfer hearing was finally scheduled for a Thursday morning in early April. It was held at the Maricopa County Superior Court in downtown Phoenix. I arrived early. They both looked entirely unbothered, carrying their heavy leather briefcases with the casual, terrifying confidence of professional executioners. At exactly 8:40 a.m., the polished elevator doors chimed, and the enemy arrived. Sandra walked down the long hallway, looking like she had already won the absolute lottery. Gerald Marsh walked beside her, looking like the expensive, silver-haired legal shark he was paid $1,000 an hour to be. And trailing just behind them, looking incredibly smug and practically strutting, was Marcus. I felt my jaw tighten so hard my teeth ground together. Sandra saw me looking at Marcus, and her smirk widened into a full, victorious smile. "Thomas," she said, her voice dripping with fake, sickening sympathy. "He has a real modern vision for the future." "A vision," I repeated, my voice dangerously flat, devoid of any emotion. Marcus stepped forward, intentionally invading my personal space. He looked at me with open, mocking disdain, the exact kind of look a bully gives a victim he thinks is far too weak to ever fight back. "Yeah, a vision, Tommy boy," Marcus sneered, his heavy, expensive cologne practically stinging my nostrils. "We're going to clean house. Maybe you can go hammer some nails somewhere." He reached out and mockingly patted my shoulder, digging his fingers in just a little too hard. It was a massive, fatal mistake. My military combat reflexes fired before conscious thought even fully registered. I punched him with exactly enough targeted, calculated force to drive every single ounce of oxygen out of his lungs without breaking any ribs. Marcus made a pathetic, high-pitched squeaking sound like a rapidly deflating tire. His eyes bugged completely out of his head, and he instantly collapsed to his knees right there, on the polished marble floor of the courthouse hallway, gasping desperately and clawing at his throat for air like a landed fish. Sandra shrieked, taking a massive, terrified step back, her face instantly turning pale with utter horror. Gerald Marsh froze, his hand hovering over his briefcase, his legal brain short-circuiting. "Assault!" Sandra screamed at the top of her lungs. "Gerald, call the police right now." "He just assaulted Marcus." I stood perfectly still over Marcus, looking down at his gasping form with absolute, cold-blooded contempt. "He tripped," I said calmly, casually adjusting my shirt cuffs. Kevin Mercer leaned casually against the marble wall, not even blinking, not a single hair out of place. It would be a terrible shame to delay these legal proceedings with a frivolous police report, when we are mere minutes away from officially transferring the company into your name. The mention of the company snapped Sandra instantly out of her panic. He didn't say another single word, scurrying to the back of the group like a kicked dog. "Let's just get this over with," Sandra hissed, aggressively smoothing out her white blazer. "I want my company right this way," Kevin said politely, holding the heavy wooden door to the hearing room wide open. We all filed in and took our respective seats. There was no jury, no dramatic courtroom audience, just a stern judge, a court clerk, and the final legal transfer of a massive estate. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with tight gray hair, meticulously reviewed the filings on her elevated bench. She confirmed that I, Thomas Allen Livingston, had formally, legally consented to the transfer of all LLC interests to Sandra Livingston without any contest whatsoever. The judge looked directly down at Kevin. "Does your client have any objections to this transfer, Mr. Mercer?" "None whatsoever, Your Honor," Kevin replied smoothly, standing up briefly. "Mr. Livingston is in full, complete agreement with the transfer exactly as documented." I watched Sandra physically relax in her wooden chair. Her tense shoulders dropped a full inch. "I took everything you ever cared about." The judge signed the official binding order. The company legally belonged to her. It was done. "The transfer is approved and finalized," the judge stated, hitting her gavel lightly. That was the exact moment Gerald Marsh, Sandra's high-priced, arrogant lawyer, reached into his leather briefcase for the business assets schedule. He was legally required to review it for the court record before the session was formally adjourned. Gerald opened the pristine manila folder. He read the first page. He flipped to the second page. He stopped, completely. I sat back comfortably in my chair and watched it happen in beautiful, glorious slow motion. His expression shifted progressively, radically, as his highly trained legal brain processed what his eyes were reading. and desperately, frantically refused to accept the brutal calculation. He looked slowly up at Kevin Mercer. It was the look of an apex predator who had just locked the steel cage from the outside and swallowed the only key. Gerald looked back down at the document, the specific single sentence that had just legally nuked his client's entire future and vaporized millions of dollars. The sentence that described the current, total asset value of Livingston General Contractors LLC, as of the date of transfer, following the secret, heavily documented October restructuring into my father's family trust. Gerald's professional voice completely cracked as he read it out loud to the silent, waiting courtroom. Net asset value $0.00. The silence in that hearing room was absolute, heavy and suffocating. But in a courtroom, when millions of dollars have just vanished into thin air without a trace, 5 seconds feels like an eternity. Sandra was completely speechless, her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at Gerald in total, uncomprehending confusion. Gerald Marsh set the document down on the heavy wooden table, with the deliberate, terrified care of a man trying not to detonate a live bomb. He looked up at the judge, his face completely pale, all of his arrogance gone. "Your Honor," Gerald whispered, his professional composure utterly destroyed. "I need to request an immediate emergency recess." The judge, clearly irritated by the sudden dramatic disruption to her schedule, granted a 10-minute recess. Sandra practically leaped out of her chair, her nails digging into Gerald's arm with manic, desperate intensity. "Why does it say 0? Gerald wouldn't even look at her. He couldn't. "Not in here, Sandra," he gritted out, hauling her aggressively toward the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. They spilled out into the brightly lit hallway. Marcus, still clutching his stomach and wheezing pathetically from my punch, scrambled desperately after them, completely, utterly confused. I stayed in my seat. I casually, methodically poured myself a glass of ice water from the silver pitcher on the table, took a long, refreshing sip, and slid a second glass across the table to Kevin. "How are you doing, Thomas?" Kevin asked quietly, not breaking eye contact, his voice steady. "I've never been better, Kevin," I replied, and I meant every single syllable. The weight of the last few weeks was lifting off my chest like a heavy stone. Through the thick glass panel beside the hearing room door, I had an absolute front row seat to the execution. And then I watched her entire expression shatter into a million pieces. The composed, arrogant widow's mask, the one she had been wearing flawlessly since the funeral, since the brutal eviction email, since she patronizingly told me we should move forward as a family, was brutally ripped off in real time. Her face twisted from confusion to absolute horror, and finally into the specific, unhinged, rabid fury of a predator who suddenly realizes they just walked straight into a steel trap. She violently shoved the heavy doors open and stormed back into the hearing room, ignoring her lawyer's desperate, panicked protests to stop. "What did you do?" She screamed at me. "What did you do to my company?" I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at her with the cold, absolute detachment of a combat engineer inspecting a demolished bridge. "Months ago, that is fraud," she shrieked, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at Kevin Mercer. "He illegally stripped the assets from the estate. He stole my money. I'm calling the police." Kevin Mercer stood up slowly, casually buttoning his suit jacket. His voice was smooth, deadly, and completely devoid of emotion. "He restructured his business, Sandra. Your husband was entirely within his legal rights to leave you exactly what he left you. He did this to cut me out," she wailed, tears of pure, unadulterated rage streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "He lied to me. He did this to protect his life's work from a parasite." Kevin corrected her, his tone dropping an octave, becoming something incredibly dangerous. Gerald Marsh hurried back into the room, looking completely panicked and thoroughly defeated. He grabbed Sandra's arm, pulling her back. "Anything you say is on the record." But she couldn't stop. She was spiraling. She turned to me, her eyes wild and bloodshot. "I will sue you for everything. Thomas, I will bankrupt you." Kevin Mercer sighed deeply, reaching calmly into his leather briefcase. This was the moment, the kill shot my father had prepared for us. "You could certainly try to sue, Sandra," Kevin said, pulling out a thick, bright red folder and sliding it smoothly across the polished table toward Gerald Marsh. "But before you file a single piece of paperwork, I highly suggest your attorney reviews the findings of the independent forensic audit your husband commissioned last year." Gerald opened the red folder, his eyes scanned the top page, his jaw visibly tightened. Specifically, Kevin continued, his voice echoing with absolute authority in the quiet room. The detailed financial records documenting exactly how you, Sandra Livingston, created fake vendor invoices from a Nevada shell company to actively embezzle $263,000 from your husband's business. Sandra stopped breathing. She literally stopped breathing. Her chest froze, her face completely drained of all color, turning a sickly, chalky white. "If you contest this transfer," Kevin said, leaning forward and resting his hands flat on the table, staring her down, "I will immediately file this documentation with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for felony wire fraud and grand theft. You have 5 seconds to decide." Marcus, who had been listening in absolute horror from the doorway, finally realized the ship wasn't just sinking, it had already hit the bottom of the ocean. He looked at Sandra, looked at the red folder of evidence, and then looked at me, realizing I was the one who had just knocked the wind out of him. She didn't even look back. Gerald Marsh, looking like a man who had just narrowly avoided stepping on a live landmine, closed the red folder and handed it back to Kevin. "I believe my client and I need to have a very long conversation regarding my continued representation in this matter." Spoiler alert. Gerald formally withdrew as her attorney exactly 11 days later, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest, which is the polite, professional lawyer speak for "my client is a massive criminal, and I am getting as far away from this disaster as humanly possible." Sandra collapsed heavily into a chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. She was left with a massive, expensive house she couldn't afford to maintain without my father's income, an empty corporate shell worth absolutely $0, and the terrifying knowledge that I held the keys to her freedom in a red folder. The judge returned a moment later, completely oblivious to the absolute massacre that had just occurred in her courtroom. Sandra legally inherited a company with no employees, no money, no equipment, and no contracts. She inherited a piece of paper with a letterhead. I didn't say anything triumphant to her as I walked out of the courtroom. It's the sound of walking away, knowing the threat has been completely neutralized and your family's legacy is secure. A few weeks later, I drove out to a massive new commercial warehouse project in the Deer Valley area. Doug Carver was out there managing the site, the concrete trucks roaring, pouring massive foundations, the giant steel beams going up exactly on schedule. I parked my truck, put on my bright high-visibility vest and my dad's old scuffed hard hat, and walked the perimeter of the active site. It was the exact smell of my father. I stood there for a long time, watching the massive cranes move effortlessly against the blue sky. And a true builder always thinks about the structural integrity of what happens long after they are gone. He didn't execute his brilliant secret plan out of blind rage or petty revenge. He did it because he knew that 110 loyal families depended on the paychecks this company generated, and he wasn't going to let a greedy, entitled parasite tear it all down for a quick payday. I spent years of my life trying to be the good guy, trying to be careful, trying to avoid conflict, trying to be the polite adult stepson who didn't rock the boat. But that passive neutrality is exactly what allowed a predator like Sandra to infiltrate our lives and nearly destroy everything we had built. The ultimate lesson I carry from this, the lesson I want you to take away from this story, is not that you should be hopelessly paranoid of everyone you meet. The lesson is that love, family, and strict, uncompromising due diligence are not opposites. You can love a person deeply and still demand they sign the contract. You can be completely loyal to your family and still know exactly where the money is going and what the legal paperwork actually says. My father knew. He protected his empire, he protected his employees, and he left me with something incredibly powerful that I could actually work with. That is the inheritance that truly matters. And every single morning before I head to the job site, I sit in my kitchen, drink a cup of black coffee, and know that the foundation is finally, unbreakably solid. If you enjoyed this story of absolute calculated justice, do me a quick favor. Thanks for watching.